President Biden signed today a bill that had passed both the Senate and the House in recent days, providing a lot more weapons and ammunition for Ukraine. They have been touting this for quite a long time. They've been fighting for literally 6 months since the Biden first put up the request. It was now became law, and according to many reports, both from the White House and from the media, a lot of those weapons had actually already been pre-positioned. Some of them are on the way now. Some were actually already in the region, and so some of it will start showing up to the battlefield very soon. The big question is will this make a difference on the ground? Will this prompt Russia to take some actions that they haven't before? Because part of the issue involved here is long-range ATACMS, what's called Army Tactical Munitions, basically Army Tactical Missiles, which have a range of up to 300 miles, which can go a lot further than anything has before. So the question is going to be, Russia has said in the past that that's going to be a problem, that they might retaliate and respond if those missiles are used on Russian territory. Was that just a boast? Was that just an empty threat? Or do they actually mean it? And if so, what might they do? Those are things we're going to look at today. And as always, we have somebody great to help us unpack some of that stuff. And it's one of our new favorites, Colonel Jacques Baud. And man, we are so grateful to have you on. Former Swiss strategic intelligence officer, former NATO officer, and author of so many books that really, I mean, you wrote the book on nearly everything. So great to have you back, Colonel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back here in your show. Thank you.
So let's get into the first point here, even before I start showing you some of the clips here. Just from, even without knowing what's in this bill, what is your gut reaction to tell you, is this going to make a difference on the battlefield?
No, definitely not. This is just a face-saving exercise for the Biden administration. The thing is that if you noticed, the West is slowly crossing all the red lines it established for itself in the past 2 years. First, we didn't want to send military equipment, but finally we did. We didn't want to send M1 Abrams, we did. We didn't want to send missiles, and now we are doing it. So I mean, this is the same for the Germans. At the beginning, they just wanted to send some helmets and things like this, and finally they are discussing sending Taurus missiles. So we are crossing all these lines, and this just shows that everything we have done has just failed. And the reason of insisting of sending equipment is just, as I said, a face-saving exercise, just to try to avoid the criticism of having done nothing for a situation that was desperate for the very first day, in fact.
Well, that's what it appears to me, that a face-saving, but a face-saving still has to have some pathway to get off the stage so that the truth doesn't become exposed. We don't seem to be doing that. As a matter of fact, here's a couple of statements from President Biden just hours ago when he was trying to explain really what's at stake here. Check this out.
It's amazing what they do. I mean, it's amazing against such a larger military. Ukraine has regained over half the territory that Russia took from them in this invasion. And they won important victories against Russia's Navy. But make no mistake about it, they're a fighting force with the will and the skill to win. The will and the skill to win.
See, that doesn't sound like I'm trying to get off the stage and just get rid of it for now. First of all, he's making this, I'm sick and tired of hearing this claim that's almost a talking point, that Ukraine has recovered 50% of the territory they took from the beginning. That's deceptive at best, and it's just a lie at worst.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because what happened earlier on doesn't matter. It's what's happened, especially in the last year plus, now in a year and a half, and what's happening now is really what matters. And I assure you, they're not gaining territory on the Ukraine side. But the last part he said there is what I want to ask you about. First of all, he says that, the Ukraine won some big naval battles. And to be honest, they did. They have sunk a lot of the ships of the Black Sea Fleet. That doesn't have anything to do with the ground fighting, as you've said before. But when he says they have the skill and the will to win, what do you think of that?
No, they don't have the skills. They probably have the will because everybody wants to win. But the problem is that they don't have the right army for that. First of all, remember that the Ukrainian army, as it was at the very beginning of the Russian offensive, was basically made ineffective just by May, June 2022. So in something like 3 4 months, the Ukrainian army was just ineffective, and that's the reason why Zelensky started to ask for foreign assistance and support in providing equipment, and then the Europeans sent old ex-Soviet equipment that was still in the storage of East European countries, and that this equipment was sent to Ukraine and lasted up to the end of 2022. And as this was exhausted, the the Zelensky asked to have more modern equipment or Western equipment, and from that point, that was mid-December 2022, we started to talk about Leopard tank, Challenger tank, M1 Abrams tank, and so on, Bradleys, and so on. And that was delivered at the beginning of 2023 in order to perform the so-called counteroffensive of June 2023. And this was, in fact, destroyed during that counteroffensive. And now we have Zelensky repeating the same exercise, asking for new weapon, asking for new support, asking for everything, because the problem is, as I already said, is that the Ukrainian army was not in a position or capable of using the equipment it received in a consistent manner. The Russians have a consistent doctrine, a military doctrine, equipment that is tailored for that doctrine, people, officers, and a command and control structure that is tailored for that doctrine. The problem is that Ukraine has a patchwork army with no real command and control structure adapted to that kind of army. The Ukrainian army has probably physically disappeared because, as we have learned this is Russian figures, but if in reality, if we look at some Ukrainian information, it seems that it be confirmed that the Ukrainians have lost like 500,000 people. That means that all these guys that were fighting since February 2022, they probably have disappeared. So we have now an army that has been poorly trained, very rapidly sent to the battlefront without real experience. Even the soldiers complained that the NATO trainers that they had in UK and Germany didn't know about the kind of warfare that was waged in Ukraine, because these guys had Ukraine or Afghanistan experience, which is a totally different kind of experience. As a result, we have an army which is not in a position. They probably have the will. I partly agree with that. I say partly because more and more we see Ukrainian units that refuse to obey orders, including the famous Azov battalion, which in fact is the equivalent of what you had in the German army if you compare the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS, which was the elite force, which was very strongly indoctrinated and all that. So the Azov battalion, today is the 3rd Storm Brigade. These guys are extremely politically, ideologically oriented. And when these guys start to refuse obey order, I think we are facing an internal crisis within the force. So I think maybe the will is there. We can question that, but they certainly have not the capacity and the capability.
And I think from the beginning that the will has unquestionably been there. Why wouldn't it be? I mean, if your country was invaded by another country and your cities were getting blown up, of course you have the will to do it. But the question has always been, do they have the capacity? And I love the description you just gave there, because it is so much more than just having a few high-profile weapon systems like the ones that you mentioned there, and it's having a system And that includes everything from logistics, from training, from institutional, the doctrine that you're talking about, and all of that inculcated together is vital. It's essential to win.
Absolutely.
And they've got almost none of that.
Absolutely. I think we underestimate that sometimes in the West, that an army is a system. And you cannot just assemble things from here and there to make something. An army is a system and has to work as a system. The command and control, doctrine, logistic, everything must fit together. And that's exactly what is missing for Ukraine. So I'm not sure this will be an advantage for Ukraine now. The support we provide. In addition to that, when we talk about the success on the Black Sea, well, the Black Sea is a sideshow, because everything what happens is on the ground, not on the sea. So they may have hit some ships and things like that, mostly without significant damage, by the way. So ships have been hit, but with no real, let's say, major impact on the capabilities of the Russians in the Black Sea. But even if it were so, the war happens on the ground. And what, as you rightly pointed out, what Biden says is just a lie, and that was demonstrated. I think, if I remember, it was an article of the New York Times that explained that, in fact, the Russians got more territory than the one that was recovered by the
Yes,
Ukrainians. So
that is correct.
and that was end of last year, if I remember. So
Yeah.
this is.
So we're going to break down in just a second what's in this package, and then we're going to look at what some other people are saying about it here, and I want your commentary on that. But one of the other fundamental things that Biden said today, which is repeated by a lot of different people, but I want your commentary on it here. I think I know what you're going to say, but I don't want to say it for you. First of all, here's what Biden said about the consequences of what this war could mean.
As I've argued for months, this is directly in the United States' national security interest. If Putin triumphs in Ukraine, the next move of Russian forces could very well be a direct attack on a NATO ally. And you all know full well that invoking Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty would be the first thing that comes to mind, which declares an attack on one as an attack on all. If Putin attacks a NATO ally like he's attacking Ukraine today, we'd have no choice but to come to their aid.
Now, you're not an American officer, so maybe you can't authoritatively say whether it is or isn't in America's vital national interest that Ukraine win. But I think you can say with a lot of confidence, address his comment there, that if Russia, first of all, defeats all of Ukraine, that it could then march on NATO. What do you say in terms of that capability?
Well, first of all, of course, I cannot speak as an American because I'm not, as you rightly said. But if it's in U.S. interest, then it would be in European interest as well. Because at the end of the day, if I take for granted what Biden said, then the whole European security is at stake here. But I think it's totally wrong. The Russians have demonstrated extremely careful planning, careful understanding of the strategic situation. And if we look at the way they wage this war, they are always in a position. I mean, they never went full steam into an offensive, an all-out offensive, and to deploy equipment, troops, and weapons that are totally destructive. They are very progressive in the way they wage their war, in order to have always be able to step up their offensive, and that's something we tend to ignore in Europe, also because the media propagandizes something totally different. We always have the impression that the Russians go always full power in the conflict. It's not exactly true. They keep their forces in order to have the capacity to increase the pressure, and they have the ability to increase progressively the pressure. That's exactly what we see. For instance, if we talk about the destruction of the power on the power grid, for instance, last year you had already missile strikes on the Ukrainian power grid, but they attacked just the distribution centers, something that could be easily repaired. And today they increase the pressure and they attack the electricity production
Yeah.
power plant. So that means they are
And
able
let me
to.
ask you that question, because I did notice that. I did notice that last year it was on the distribution centers, and I noticed that it was repaired a lot. And I was wondering, why would they spend so many missiles doing something that could be quickly repaired, and then why the change this year to the actual production facilities, which can't be replaced quickly? What's the difference?
Well, most probably, and there is a very excellent article from John Helmer on the Dance with Bears on his blog, and he explained that quite in details. And I think there's a very good explanation of that. It is the idea that then it was the purpose was to deplete the Ukrainian anti-aircraft, anti-missile capabilities, and they attacked items that Ukraine was obliged to protect through anti-aircraft missiles, but they didn't want to attack civilian centers or population. And today it's different, because now we see that the Ukrainians are missing all these missiles. They have no anti-aircraft missile anymore. So meaning that now they have a free space, if you want, to attack wherever they want. And now they can really attack deeper into Ukrainian territory. They can attack more strategic significant system. But the reason why they did that last year is that they wanted to deplete the anti-aircraft missile because they expected this counteroffensive, and they had they feared they had not the air supremacy to protect their own forces, and they were not able to bomb the attacking Ukrainian forces. So that's why they rushed against the power grid to make the Ukrainian use this missile. And if you remember, in the leaked Pentagon documents that were produced, and you had a map of the Ukrainian capabilities in terms of anti-aircraft missiles, and there is a very interesting map where they showed that by May last year, almost all anti-aircraft capabilities were depleted in Ukraine. And that means that just before the start of the so-called counteroffensive, Ukraine had no longer any anti-aircraft capability. So that was an extremely wise operation in order to have then free hand to protect their own force with the aviation and attack helicopters. And that's exactly what we have seen during the counteroffensive.
So what you're describing there is really a patient and methodical process to just go after these areas here. And now it's looking like the city of Kharkiv might possibly be a next target. But all of that, to me, says makes it nearly impossible that Biden is telling the truth, or that he's even accurate, and that as soon as they're, quote, finished with Ukraine, that they're going to roll into a 32-member alliance with any possibility of success. I mean, to me, it seems like it would be just suicidal for any leader to do that. And Putin is anything but suicidal. How do you relate to that part?
No, absolutely. I fully agree with you. The Russians have an extremely, I mean, the Russian general staff is known to be very good in planning. And in fact, if we observe from a very impartial point of view, the operation that was planned in the very beginning of this operation, I mean, on February 2022, we see that it was very carefully planned. It was not using too much force, but just the necessary force to achieve a certain objective, but very clear objectives. And that's exactly what we are doing. Remember, this operation was meant to demilitarize Ukraine, not to invade Ukraine, not to destroy NATO, not to attack the rest of the world and things like this. This was to demilitarize the threat against the population of Donbass. Since then, this objective has been reached, and they raised, in the Clausewitzian perspective, they have raised this objective, and now they are managing to demilitarize Ukraine, and they will continue that as long as we help Ukraine. They will continue demilitarizing Ukraine, and demilitarizing not just in terms of military capabilities, but also in terms of economic capacities. I mean, I have mentioned already, I think, in this program, that the Germans plan to have to create a production plant for Leopard. I mean, the new version of the Leopard tank, and Rheinmetall was, in principle, basically committed to build a production plant in Ukraine, and the Russians are making everything impossible to do. In fact, they're just destroying the whole industrial network that Ukraine has, and the Russians have understood that if they don't do that, we will continue to make this, to extend this war, to continue to provide weapons, to make an unending war. So the idea of the Russians is to make this exercise stop and to make impossible for Ukraine to continue. They will destroy everything.
Let's say that they eventually, whether there's negotiated settlement or if there's not, and Russia goes all the way, say, to the Dnieper and compels an end of war negotiation on basically terms of surrender, will they then go into Western Europe?
No, they will certainly not. This is not their objective. They never said they would do that. We don't even see, again, it's important to understand. We in the media, in the Western media, we try to portray the Russians are waging war without objectives. This is wrong. The Russians work with objectives. They have objective, they stick to that objective, and they work with that. So if we try, it's the same as if we read our so-called experts, they tell you that they wanted to invade Ukraine, to expand Russia, to make a new Tsarist empire, the new Soviet Union. The Russians have never said that. So we invent objectives, we make them out. And the Russians have never said that. They have defined very consistent, very how to say that, reachable objectives, and they proceed very consistently towards these objectives. So it's totally absurd to create objectives. The fact is that we create objectives for the Russians, and then to say, well, they didn't reach these objectives.
Right, right. And then we ignore what they actually did say. There's a lot of that going on here. Let me shift back into where we started with this aid package here. Let's look at a few things. So not all the West are actually getting on board with cheerleading. So there's a little bit of optimism here that some of the truth is getting out. Here's Sky News saying that this is more like a lifeline than it can change the war.
There's no doubt that they'll be useful, but like every weapon in war, whether they're long or short range, fancy or not fancy, that there is no silver bullet to victory in this war. There is no wonder weapon, no single wonder weapon that is going to deliver a decisive long-term advantage to Ukraine if it's not meshed in with a range of other technologies, tactics, people, these kind of things. So it will be useful. It will allow them to reach further into Crimea with different weapon systems. I mean, when you do long-range strike, you don't just use one weapon system, you use a variety to put the enemy in a dilemma and confuse them. It will be useful, but it is not in and of itself a war-winning weapon.
Obviously, that wasn't Sky News. We'll get to that in just a second, but that still is a good one to talk to there, because I think that this, if I remember correctly, I've seen him actually been pretty pro Ukraine and pro going down that path here. But even he says It's not a wonder weapon. It's not going to change anything with ATACMS
Yeah.
because that's one of the things in this. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what ATACMS is and why it's not decisive.
Well, ATACMS, as you know, is a long range missile that can be shot or fired from the HIMARS system, or the same launcher, basically. And the thing is that Zelensky is asking for these long range missiles since 2022. US has provided some, but with reduced range, because they didn't want the Ukrainians to reach the Russian territory. Now it appears that they have agreed to provide a long-range version of the ATACMS that range up to 300 kilometers or so. Now, the thing is, my feeling is that the reason why Zelensky wants those long-range missiles is to destroy the Kerch Bridge. I think that for the Ukrainians, destroying the Kerch Bridge is probably symbolic of a kind of victory. They know they will not be able to repel the Russians. They will not be able to make an offensive that reach Moscow or something like that. They will not push the Russian back, but they probably can destroy the Kerch Bridge. That's the reason why you see so many attempts to destroy that bridge, because I think it's more symbolic. It has kind of a moral value for the Ukrainians, and I think that's if they receive these attacks, they will be used for that. Now, it's probably not so effective because the thing is that the Russians have also understood that, and they probably have the equipment. They have a variety of counter different missile defense, and I'm not sure this will make a difference. And as you said, this kind of Wunderwaffe, so the wonder weapon, it reminds me exactly what we had in 1945 when the Germans, or specifically Hitler, because his generals were a little bit wiser, but Hitler had in mind that he could probably achieve victory just through a couple of new weapon systems. And as we know, as military, and as we said earlier in this today, an army is a system. You can't just have a victory just because you have one system. Probably we have an exception with the nuclear weapon on Hiroshima in Japan in 1945, but that's probably an exception. But for the rest, I don't think you can achieve victory just by having one system, unless it's a very powerful and
right. Yeah, something that's like, the destructive power is enough to overcome. But any typical system, and certainly long-range missiles, are one of those. When you're looking at the whole package of things, aside from just the ATACMS, you had this guy from Sky News, actually, and he's also been very pro-Ukraine but even he's saying this is not going to change the game.
I'm not sure it's going to be a turning point. This feels more like a lifeline at the moment for Ukraine. To prevail, it's going to need a steady supply of weapons. It's not going to get those. Russia is already spinning up its defence industrial base. Russia knows that it will fail if the West was to get further involved in this. And that's why we're seeing Lavrov and President Putin issue these great warnings, this threatening rhetoric. But so far, has not had the effect of actually affecting the Western political resolve, which doesn't seem to yet be determined to provide a full support to Ukraine.
Now, he's right there, and I think that just matches what you've been saying, that it's like a lifeline. It's definitely not going to change this point here. But he makes the comment at the end of that statement that I've heard from many others in the West. It says, but the West hasn't decided to give full support to Ukraine by this time. Do you see any kind of package or any amount of weapon systems or money or anything else that would decisively change the dynamics on the ground in Ukraine?
No, and just for a simple reason is that, as we see today, and we see that also if we look at the conflict in Israel, that the West has not enough capacities to produce the equipment that would be necessary for one conflict, I mean Ukraine, but even more for two conflicts. And we see that the US specifically has to take from its own storage equipment to supply Israel or Ukraine. And that's the same for France or Germany. They are taking from their own equipment to send to Ukraine, meaning that, and that contradicts also the idea that Russia would attack Ukraine after, you would attack Europe after Ukraine, because we are providing all our weapons to Ukraine, and it's our own storage, meaning that we are depleting our own capacities to provide to Ukraine. Meaning that this idea that if we don't do that, Russia could attack Europe makes no sense. But this is the problem of industrial capacity. Remember that it's probably not exactly the same in the US, but in Europe, most of the military industrial complex used to be state-owned in most countries during the Cold War. And that's why we were able to have any weapons. It's exactly the same system as the Russians have now. It's a state-owned industrial base. And since the end of the Cold War, in most countries, that applies very much to France or Switzerland or so, we privatize our equipment, meaning that the weapons production is no longer a question of the national interest, but a question of profit. Yeah. So if you don't have the prospect of having a market, so you don't expand production. And that's exactly what we have now. Even in the industry, in France, for instance, they have a hard time to find production. And that's exactly, by the way, the problem that the Czech president had, because he promised to have 1 million 155 millimeter shells. And he didn't manage to find that. Why? Because everybody understands that the defeat of Ukraine is a matter of months. And at best, it will last until the US presidential election. So meaning that why would you invest millions to expand your production facilities if everything collapses in a few months? So,
because just imagine what would be the financial motivation for a private company to invest in these things that are going to take long term. Like in the US, it's going to take about another 18 months to get up to this full capacity from now, based on this money that was put into this current bill here before the stuff's coming off. Well, if the war is ended in the next 3 or even 12 months, what are they going to do then? Now they have this big capacity and there's no orders for it.
Exactly. That's exactly the point. So, the problem of supporting Ukraine is not simply a political or a question of willingness. It's just a matter of capacity. We don't have it anymore. And this is it. And Ukraine has to understand they mismanaged the equipment they had in the first phase of the war, if I can put it that way. I mean, in the first 6 months. And since then, they are waging a war with kind of patchwork army. But now it's gone. So, but the problem of Zelensky, he knows that he cannot accept that. He cannot acknowledge that, because otherwise he would probably be killed within days. So I think he's more or less he's a kind of a death penalty on him somehow. And
but here's the problem, because I agree with you that the U.S. presidential election is a big driver for what Biden's doing and why he's saying what he's doing and how he wants to at least push this past November the 5th. And I understand why Zelensky, maybe his life is physically in danger from domestic sources if he goes down the negotiated path. I don't know. But here's the problem with the going down. The first one, obviously, that tens of thousands, if not more, Ukrainian men are going to continue to die over the next 5 or 6 months or 7 months heading into that election. But here's the other issue. Russian side of this, they have shown great patience, but we have to be careful that it's not an endless patience. Here's what Sergei Lavrov said following the passage of that bill.
Сегодня США и их натовские сателлиты по-прежнему одержимы идеей нанести России стратегическое поражение. готовы и далее сдерживать нашу страну, что называется, до последнего украинца. При этом западники опасно балансируют на грани прямого военного столкновения ядерных держав, что чревато катастрофическими последствиями.
Is there a risk that's either through miscalculation, whether Zelensky uses these long-range missiles to hit something inside of Russia, or that some other mistake can be made, or whether, say, for example, Macron gets foolish and actually sends troops into to fight on behalf of Ukraine or Poland? What is the risk, in your view, of what Lavrov's talking about? Is it real, or is he also just posturing?
Well, I think, probably a little bit of both, in the sense that personally, I'm confident that the Russian leadership, include the political as well as the military leadership, are very rational. But I'm not so confident that the European rational leadership is so rational. We see that Emmanuel Macron and even the Germans, you don't feel that they think rationally. Now they are trying again for them also to save their face, and they could be led to do anything. Look at Macron. Macron has its troops or its army expelled from Mali, from Niger, from Burkina Faso. Now it seems that Chad would go the same way. So, and he's ridiculized within his own country. He could be led to do some kind of desperate things. The problem is that when people feel that they are defeated, that they are losing the war or the conflict or whatever, they may be led to desperate things. And I think the concern of the Russians is probably that the European leadership could be led to some extreme situation. And on that, I think the Russians might be very worried. So that's the problem. But from the Russian side, I don't think so. The Russian, by the way, they have a very clear doctrine as to the use of nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapons of the Russians are designed to protect the existential threats towards Russia. That means if, for instance, the leadership or Moscow or the central leadership or the centers of leadership would be threatened, they would start considering using nuclear weapons. But they will not use nuclear weapons just to strike a unit, even a French or NATO units in Ukraine. They have enough instrument for that. They have so many hypersonic weapons that the NATO is not even able to intercept. So I think the Russians will certainly be the last ones to use the nuclear weapons if they are not directly threatened.
Yeah.
So I'm not so worried about that. So there is a little bit of
it's disappointing. It's embarrassing that you're actually more worried about the Western leaders acting irrational than the Russian leaders acting irrational. That by itself is a point of shame for us Westerners, I think.
Well, yes, but as I said at the very beginning, the problem is that the West crossed every single red lines they defined for themselves. We have defined. I mean, the Western leaders have defined red lines they would not do for Ukraine, but they have crossed all of them. So meaning that that means that the decision making is not rational, because if you define a red line, that means you define a red line. You define your red line. I mean, I will not do that. But considering everything,
and then they did it. They saw there was no action. They go, well, maybe we'll do this one and this one, and now that the risk is certainly at some point you think there are no red lines and we can do anything, and that's where it starts getting dangerous.
That's exactly the point. You see, a rational decision making would assess the situation rationally from the very beginning, say, okay, that's the situation. If it evolves in that direction, then the red line is this one. Or if in another situation, then we have this red line. But these are the things we are not going to do. But the fact of the matter is that we see that the Western leadership had absolutely no idea of the conflict they were engaging into. You see, I remember the French Minister of Economy saying on the 1st of March, that means just 1 week after the beginning of the military operation, the Russian operation, he said, we will make Russia to collapse. And obviously that has not happened. And even as a minister of economy, you should have known that Russia has a much more resilient economy, as the media said.
Right.
But obviously he didn't know that. So meaning
Right.
that we have a leadership that doesn't work. Again, I come from the background of strategic intelligence, meaning strategic intelligence is exactly the intelligence that advise the government. So meaning that when I see today how people decide, I say, but where are the strategic intelligence
Well,
officers?
and
Who
here's one more.
who is advising them?
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't show you this. We've shown this a couple of times on some of our recent shows, something that Zelensky said just a few days ago that I want to play for you, because I want to ask you from a little different perspective than we played it before. How much do you think he really means this? And how much is just acting? Because he does have some experience at that. And what's the ramifications of it in any way? So in my view, he's basically setting himself up as the savior for all of Western Europe. Check this out.
How long should Americans be expected to fund the war in Ukraine?
The Americans are not funding the war in Ukraine. They first and foremost protect freedom and democracy all over Europe. And Ukraine is fighting, and Ukraine is sending its best sons and daughters to the front line, and it reduces the price for all Europe, for all NATO. It reduces the price for everyone, including the US.
So he's here for all of it. It's like a Messiah complex. How much of that does he mean, and what is the consequence regardless of what he means?
Well, I think he's compelled to do that, because the problem of Zelensky is that he understands that Ukraine is failing, and he understands also that the Western leadership is less and less keen to support Ukraine. Not, probably politically, but also because we can't do it. So he tries to make the stake higher in order to oblige the West to respond. He knows that only the US has resources. By the way, it's interesting that you have European Union. There are 32 countries that basically should have the money to help you, but he doesn't ask to the European Union. He asked the US, because he knows that with Biden, it's a little bit easier, because you have one guy that decides, and he can just, with just a snap of the finger, it can, more or less, because we saw the difficulty in the Congress. But in any case, it's a little bit easier with the US than in Europe, because in Europe you also have some countries. Slovakia, for instance,
Hungary.
Hungary. They are questioning the purpose and the reason why we should continue supporting that instead of finding a negotiated solution, because everything we are putting in terms of money, equipment, and all that in the conflict leads nowhere. And Zelensky understands that, so he has to make the stake higher, and that's the reason why he presents himself as the savior of the world.
He can try, but here's the problem. And in the last few minutes we have here today, I wonder if you to just give your best projection of what this would mean here. So, as you pointed out, it took a long time to get this package of $60 billion, most of it, which is going back into the United States, passed. But as I was on a panel earlier today on a different show, some of the people are saying, almost certainly that's it. There won't be another funding bill like this. And what's going to happen if this was the final bill? What is Zelensky going to do if the United States Congress doesn't come up with another $100 billion like in 6 months or so? Because this is a very short-term deal, very, very going to be burned up pretty quickly, and they'll be demanding more. But I'm not sure more is coming. If no more comes, what happens to this war?
Well, there are two ways of answering the question. I can bypass your question by saying, well, if the Americans cannot provide more help, they will ask the Europeans to do it. That's probably one possibility. The other thing, if no support comes to Ukraine, I mean, Ukraine will be destroyed. And as long as Zelensky doesn't want to have a negotiate solution, and probably for domestic reasons, he cannot probably do that. By the way, as I already said, he issued a decree that prevents any negotiation with Russia as long as Vladimir Putin is in power. So I mean, we are already at this stage, meaning that there is no further help, but even if there is any help, by the way, I think because the help he will receive and everything what's left in the West, if we provide it to Ukraine, it will not change anything, because the skills of the soldiers, the willingness of the soldiers to fight is fading away, and therefore I'm confident it will not change anything. And the result is that Ukraine will be totally destroyed. And interestingly enough, I talked recently to a Ukrainian here in Brussels, and he told me exactly the same thing. He's a refugee here in Brussels, but he understands perfectly that the only issue for this his country is just to be destroyed if there is no any negotiation or negotiated solution to the conflict. The problem is that the West has no exit ramp for this conflict, and therefore we have no other option than just providing weapons. This is just insane. In fact, this just shows the incapacity of the Western leadership to understand how a situation may evolve, and that we are exactly in that dynamics.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that really so discourages me, and because I mean, you've laid it out very clearly again. Whether this is the final tranche, whether this tranche came, whether this tranche didn't come, it's not going to change the outcome. The outcome is sealed because of the larger dynamics that go into national combat power and all the things you laid out in really great detail about the systems of combat that don't exist on the Ukraine side, no matter how much money we put in there.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for coming on and providing such clarity on this, and just driving through the BS that's both in some of the European capitals and our own capital here in Washington, and getting to the hardcore ground truth reality of it. And we really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And listen, folks, you got a job to do too. We're thankful for Colonel Baud for coming out with this information here, and just shredding the thing down to the brass tacks like you've seen here. Don't keep this to yourself. Share this with other people. Share this on your social media. Like and subscribe here so that causes the algorithms to actually spread it to more people. It's more important than you may think. But take this video here, take the link and tag it on social media. Go to Twitter, go to Telegram, spread this out there so more people know the truth. Because ultimately, the thing that animates me more than anything else is that the bill payers for all of this mendacity and for all this nonsense are the Ukrainian people. And the men that they're going to need to fund their future country once they get this war over with and rebuild everything, they can't afford to throw tens of thousands of them into the trash like they're doing right now. And as long as this war continues on, that's exactly what's going to happen. They can't change the outcome. Let's share this message with as many people as possible so that more people know the truth. And maybe we can build up enough momentum for the truth that it can actually impact the decision makers. That power is potentially within your hands. So I ask you to wield it as best you can. Thank you very much for coming on today. We always appreciate you and value you. We are in this together. We will remain unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth. And we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.